today I'll be sharing really work from different colleagues of mine on the practice side, urban forest managers, who have been thinking about climate change. We got a question in the last panel of, is anyone really trying to do this? And here are two examples from East Palo Alto, California, and Philadelphia, PA. So a quick little outline, I'll be going over some of the background concepts that have informed these colleagues of mine when developing their planting strategies and restoration plans, then diving into a roadside tree example from East Palo Alto, natural areas restoration and management plans from Philly, and then some common threads. So in terms of a really core background concept, socio-ecological systems is one way to describe urban environments, not only urban, but also other rural environments where there are complex biophysical and social factors interacting, and where really it's near impossible to tease apart which part is biophysical and which part is social. In some ways, socio-ecological systems becomes almost a buzzword, but it's a way of saying, these systems are highly integrated. Going back to some of the points Dave Nowak was making earlier, there's feedbacks and kind of mediated processes going on here. And then accompanying that is the idea of not just resilience, but socio-ecological resilience. And resilience as the ability of the system to absorb changes, we have to consider in these urban environments for our urban forests, vulnerabilities in both the human and natural components. Another really core concept that informed some of my colleagues is the idea of novel ecosystems. To some extent, this is kind of a high concept, esoteric, academic term that's come up a lot in the ecology literature these days. The definition is situations where we have new species assemblages, new kinds of community composition that may then lead to new ecosystem functioning. So when you think of the combination of climate change pushing species into different ranges, as well as invasive pests, pathogens, and so on, you end up with situations where the ecosystems may have a fundamentally different kind of processes and functionings than they had in the past. And looking into the great historic record, sometimes also systems that existed many hundreds or thousands of years ago are described as no analog systems. There's no analog for them today, just as there may be no analog for the forests that are about to be created compared to what we see today. These novel ecosystems have some element of human agency, whether it's direct or indirect, and there's some debate as to whether sustained human maintenance is necessary. By some definitions, urban ecosystems are not novel, and by some definitions they are. And then having these novel ecosystems, these new species assemblages, then requires new management approaches. So diving in right away to the examples. In East Palo Alto, there's a local nonprofit called Canopy. They're based in Palo Alto. So Palo Alto and East Palo Alto are totally different municipalities. East Palo Alto is very wealthy. Housing prices are through the roof. It's where Facebook is located and Apple. And this tiny little nonprofit called Canopy, they have 2 or 3 program staff at any given time, but they also have very active board members from their local community, the benefit of many dedicated professionals working with them as well. And then East Palo Alto, kind of on the other side of the tracks, is this separate municipality. It's a separate county. It's more working class to poverty situation, some real challenges of crime. It's a mostly Latino community. And so Canopy from Palo Alto has been doing planting initiatives in East Palo Alto, working with high schools and community and civic leaders there. So the particular planting site they started out with their East Palo Alto tree initiative is a soil strip next to Highway 101. So what you see here is the trees in front of the highway sound wall. And before these trees went in, this site was just covered in trash. It's covered in lots of trash, lots of overgrown vines. And these roadside trees are next to the sound wall, and then you have the road, and next to that, on the other side of the street, is a pedestrian sidewalk, as well as apartment complexes, businesses, and so on. So planting these trees certainly makes for a much prettier environment for the folks that live and work there. And in terms of the planting design, this really gets at the heart of, how do we take information about climate change and make it actionable? For species selection, there was a really huge focus on drought tolerance. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Mediterranean climate and today's climate, not just tomorrow's. Having just finished my graduate degree in California, I was really struck by moving from the East Coast to the West Coast, The way that we create this urban forest in places like San Francisco, Sacramento, and Los Angeles, where there wouldn't be a forest otherwise without urbanization. And so much of the planting selection that is kind of conventional or typical out there are not species that can even necessarily take today's climate without irrigation. You've heard this point from a few different speakers today. And so in California, you've heard about drought recently in the news probably, big problems with drought and the agricultural sector. But drought is a normal part of climate out there. There's seasonal drought every summer. It doesn't rain. Every October, I'd have to go find my umbrella again. It doesn't rain all summer, every summer there. Now, the drought is getting more severe because of climate change. And so picking the right species to plant involves partly picking what we can plant today without using water that should really better be used in agricultural settings so that we're not using it as much to take care of the landscape. And so when the certified master arborist, who is in charge of developing this, when he went about picking the species, he said, I'm not going to plant species that are not drought tolerant. I'm not going to do anything that's not drought tolerant. And he also said, I'm going to look to Mediterranean climates from around the world and find things that are available in the nursery stock. This is very necessary. Things that are available locally from the nurseries, but perhaps things that are from Mediterranean climates that are a little further, a little hotter or a little drier than what we have in East Palo Alto today. And what he came up with was 22 different species that were all grown in container. It's a pretty common planting stock out there. Almost 600 trees and shrubs, and I'll give a few examples of the species in a minute. But then in addition to that, very experimentally decided to plant 400 seeds, 4 different species involved, mostly oaks, and wanted to just see how they were doing, because it's really cheap to plant seeds, so let's just give it a try. And so I mentioned this master arborist. His name is Dave Muffley, and a lot of this project is really his baby. He had actually before, or around the time he was designing this site, published some pieces in Western Arborist. This is a guy who had already done a lot of his homework, kind of ahead of the curve when it comes to selecting drought-tolerant species and planning ahead for climate adaptation. He actually is now the head arborist at Apple and has a really big say in what species are being demanded from the nurseries these days because he's in charge of this high-profile large site. So hopefully that'll start kind of shifting things in terms of that customer demand that we were just hearing about that's so essential to push for change in the nursery industry. And so he'd already been working on lists of trees that are appropriate for California. He'd gone acorn hunting in Texas, for example, trying to find things that are more accustomed to hotter and drier climates. So here are some of the more common containerized shrubs and trees that were planted. The site was designed, just to go back to a couple pictures, the site was designed to have these overstory, taller trees with some smaller, more shrub-like growth in between, so strawberry tree as well as Scots pine in between that can grow in a more shrubby form if they're allowed to. And so some of the more common trees that were planted included that strawberry tree, Marina madrone, European olive, also smaller numbers of African olive, Scots pine, cork oak, water gum, and there were a lot more others that were planted in quite smaller numbers simply because he couldn't get as many of them as he wanted. And so these are not all native, but then again, there aren't that many natives in that area because it's not natively forested cover. And so really tried to think outside the box and plant more species in this site that aren't necessarily popular throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. And then in terms of those plants that were planted from seed, that included Catalina cherry, Santa Cruz island oak. Those are native to that area of California, but he thought they would do well with future climates, as well as 2 different oak species from other parts of the world. And most of the Santa Cruz island oak died, but it didn't really matter because they were from seed. Wasn't really a very expensive proposition to begin with. And so I worked with these folks in Canopy in East Palo Alto. Gentleman over there, that's Dave Muffley, I keep referring to, worked with them to track establishment survival in this project because tree mortality was the focus of my dissertation research. And then I couldn't really do much with the data because so many trees lived. After 4 years of the containerized trees, 96% survived. It was just absolutely astonishing. The annual mortality was under 1%, and this is the highest survival rate that I've ever seen during establishment. And it wasn't just due to the planting palette, but certainly that had a big role. Here's a picture of Dave standing next to one of the trees that was lost. So even in the very best planning situations, best maintained sites, this tree was lost because a car ran into the sound wall and burned it up, and burned up the adjacent tree. And that was the case with a few other of the trees that were lost as well. Now that we're getting past establishment and past the period when they were watering these trees, a few of the Scots pine are being lost as well. They seem to have too much sun exposure. So our suspicions on reasons for establishment success. Now, I didn't go through the fancy statistics I usually do to come up with this list, but from observing the site over many years and talking to the program staff, this is the story that we think happened. The personnel involved had a lot of expertise and a lot of dedication. Between the master arborist and the staff and the board members, this site was visited just all the time, more than a once-a-year maintenance. They were driving by it, checking to see how the trees were doing and so forth. In terms of the planting, that species selection was really critical. These trees are all intended to be appropriate for today's climate and tomorrow's climate. The arborist went and handpicked from the nursery stock to make sure that he wasn't getting the poor quality stock. Planting day involved contractors doing the planting, but they were closely supervised to make sure that any trees that were root bound were really heavily worked before they went into the ground. In terms of maintenance, because it's a relatively small geographic area, it was about a mile on either side of this highway, it was a little just easier to do. You could kind of go up and down a row as opposed to going to scattered street trees all over the city. And they did put irrigation lines in. I said they were drought tolerant, but to give them the best shot during the first 3 years, irrigation lines were put in, and now those lines have been turned off. However, during the different maintenance days, the crews would be out there checking for kinks in every single line to make sure that every tree was getting the water it needed to. There were youth interns from the local community in East Palo Alto that were getting career training for green jobs and also just learning more about arboriculture and natural resource management. So they're getting invested in the site and they're doing a lot of the maintenance. Different days I would be out there trying to measure the trees or see how they were surviving. There were volunteers from Google, volunteers from different corporate campuses nearby, and so it just speaks to the resources that this Palo Alto-based organization was able to pull in. So now switching over to Philly, very different kind of site type. I'll be talking about an ecological restoration project in Philly. And so as some background, the city parklands include a mix of natural areas and neighborhood parks, and these are collectively referred to as the Fairmount Park System. It's managed by Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, and most of these parks, the watershed or natural area parks, were created to protect water supply in the 1800s. They were actually mostly cut down at that time for various mills and industry. And so a lot of what we think of as the natural areas are actually all regrowth anyway. So that then leads to a lot of different invasives and different species mixes in there. So Philadelphia just recently did an iTree Eco study, and we had extra concentration of plots within the parklands, and these parklands constitute only 9% of the city's land area, but 38% of the city's trees. They have 64% canopy cover throughout all of the park system versus 20% citywide, and based on that iTree Eco model, these parklands are providing 1/3 of the key ecosystem services throughout the city. And so this is all relevant background to say why it's so important that the Ecosystem Management Division of Parks and Rec is considering some new approaches for restoring and maintaining these natural areas. Here's a picture, or a map rather, of the Fairmount Park System. As you can see, most of the big parklands follow along different rivers and creeks. And I'll be talking mostly about, if I can get this pointer to work, that Cobbs Creek area over here. And Cobbs Creek Park and the surrounding neighborhood is a relatively low-income, mostly African-American community. The park has been somewhat underutilized over the years because of concerns over crime and so forth, as opposed to some of the other park systems, which might be next to wealthier communities that have a bit more maintenance and kind of friends of the park's activities. And so back in 1999, Parks and Recreation and the Fairmount Park System, they participated in this huge comprehensive restoration master plan. The Academy of Natural Sciences and their scientists were involved. It was a, I think, 5 or 6 volume treatise. It's all available online on the museum's website. And it has these incredibly detailed maps and documentation of current and historic vegetation and lays forth what should be done for restoration going forward. And I'm going to call this the more or less conventional restoration approach. Not that there's any one restoration approach really, but here was the goal in terms of restoration as articulated in that 1999 plan. Restore the composition and structure of vegetation native to the parks in order to establish self-sustaining ecological communities. So this all sounds well and good. They did a lot of restoration in the early 2000s to try and meet this goal, but the invasives came back in, or the parks went back into disrepair. And so the question is, what's the return on investment, and how are we trying to really build for tomorrow's forest and ensure that sustainability of these systems? So they've taken a fundamentally new approach over just the last year or two. This quote here comes from Joan Blaustein. She's the director of ecosystem management in Philadelphia Parks and Rec, and she sent an invitation to myself and many other scientists and practitioners in the area to a urban forest work group. And included within that, she had all this discussion of novel ecosystems that I mentioned earlier, with all these citations that related to courses I took in grad school. And I was wondering, this is just incredible. Where is she coming from with all of this kind of new approach? So what she asked in that invitation letter was, as we begin the next phase of management of our urban forests, it is clear that we can no longer rely on the principles and procedures that we used in the past to restore and reclaim. So basically saying, we did that fabulous master plan, but we have to start moving in a new direction. We shouldn't just be talking about restoring natives and going back to the past, because we have to think about the future. So this is a pretty fundamental paradigm shift in that management approach. The starting premise being novel ecosystems and novel pressures combined with, quite frankly, budget realities. They're never going to have the budget to do all of the invasives removal that they'd like to do, but still maintaining that commitment to diversity, and also prioritizing input from stakeholders and communities. And that's something that wasn't necessarily as highly integrated in the past, but saying that in order to make our forest sustainable, going back to that idea of socio-ecological resilience, we have to have community input, we have to have nearby residents involved. And so what they're really proposing is an adaptive management cycle that involves participatory research, viewing management as experimentation, being willing to take risks, and having that feedback loop of manage, monitor, and learn. And here's another great quote from the invitation letter that talks about the essential role of community engagement. Together we hope to create new approaches to restoration in a changing world and establish new protocols for decision-making by connecting technicians and land managers to citizens through a participatory research process. And here's how they went about doing that at the Cobbs Creek site. One component was a free land management course. So in addition to these kind of experts from academia, the Forest Service, and local urban forest managers coming together, at the same time, concurrently, a free course was being offered to local civic leaders and community residents from the Cobbs Creek neighborhood to say, here are some kind of basic premises in ecology and urban forestry that we'd like to share with you, and then that you can use to give feedback to us with what we should do with this land. And then a planning charrette happened, which engaged local people, land managers, and researchers, all kind of standing shoulder to shoulder, side by side, looking at maps, giving suggestions. And through this process, part of what came out of it was that the local residents were expressing interest in recreation opportunities. So that's not something that's really been discussed at all during this conference. It's all about climate change and species adaptation, but you ask the nearby neighbors and they're going to want to make sure there's recreation opportunities or make sure there's appropriate signage to translate what kind of restoration activities have been going on to people that might be walking through the park. And also, there's a big interest in doing academic research with citizen scientists, using these folks who've taken a land management course as the field crews that will do the monitoring going forward, partly to produce the data that can inform the Fairmount Park managers with how they might change things as they move forward with their planting, but also to sustain that investment and sense of ownership of the park with the local neighborhood. And so this process is still ongoing. They're getting ready to put out to bid some of the trees and species that will be removed, but they haven't fully decided on what all to plant, so I can't give all the results of how it's fared, but we're trying to work with Fairmount Park, with these land managers, to do that in the years ahead. Here's a map of the site, and the folks at Philly Parks and Rec delineated these different stand types, and I don't want to go into all the detail about them, but first just to point out that this is right next to the city. These are all classic Philly row houses here and here, got train tracks. The airport is not very far away, so it's a forest fragment really heavily embedded within the urban landscape, and there are going to be continued inputs of invasives from these neighboring landscapes in the future. One decision that they've made regarding this question of what should we do about natives? Should we continue planting natives? Should we get rid of all the invasives? The stand type 1 over here is not a native species. It's dominated by European, next slide, dominated by European black alder, and they decided, we're going to leave black alder in place. It's got some understory that seems to be supporting some different bird communities, and let's just leave it alone. We're going to take out some of the other invasives that were in the middle of the site, but let's leave this one alone. And maybe they'll continue debating that decision going forward. Maybe they'll revisit in a few years and decide to take it out. But for now, they're going to leave it in place. And so those are the kind of decisions that are really going against the old way of doing things for restoration in the city, but that they're trying to kind of selectively choose which invasives are we going to stop fighting. And also, with regard to planting selection, trying to encourage local seed propagation. One of the stand types there that was more isolated had some good diversity of native oaks, and what can we do to encourage those native oaks to propagate as we remove other species? Considering planting southern species, and as I think one of the other speakers mentioned earlier, it's not just a matter of pick a species from a few states south, but rather looking at species where their current habitat envelope includes Philadelphia, but maybe Philly's at the northern range, and so trying to plant things we already know will do okay, but are at the northern range of their limit today and should theoretically continue to thrive as temperatures change. They're considering other forms of experimental species migration, but are kind of working out the fine points of the details. A lot of debate has gone on through that planning charrette and other meetings to decide which exact species to prioritize. And certainly some of the kind of information gap here is being able to translate those large state or regional or national models into something that's actionable in Philly. So figuring out not just temperature changes, but also storm events and precipitation regimes and so on. It's something that they're struggling with figuring out how to do, but marching ahead anyway, knowing that they have to do something. And related to that, here are then the common threads across these two sites that have very different situations, very different planting sites, but the main thrust of it is translating science, translating all the kind of research you've heard about these last 2 days into action, making local decisions about species based on local priorities, deciding when it's okay to plant natives, when it's okay not to, really trying to make sure that the species can live today as they're being established and hopefully survive into that future climate, and making sure that we incorporate a regional and local context in terms of both the ecological communities and human management. And one of the biggest themes that kept coming up as I was preparing for this talk and chatting with my colleagues in Philly Parks and Rec and in California was management in the face of uncertainty, and kind of admitting the limits of what we know, but not being paralyzed by that climate uncertainty that was mentioned by Chris Swanson earlier. So these are managers that are kind of recognizing that they don't know everything. Even the very best experts can't answer every one of their questions. They don't have the benefit of being in the kind of first pilot test region of the work that Chris and Leslie are doing, but they're plowing ahead, knowing that they've done as much homework as they could do and wanting to really shift the way that things have been done. So as much as it's about the finer details of what to plant, it's also about advocating to their policymakers and their politicians about we need to move ahead in this new way and view the management that we're doing as experimentation and be willing to make some mistakes along the way. And also in both sites, community engagement through youth staff and through participatory research process, especially in Philly, has been viewed as absolutely essential. That it's not just about deciding what to plant, it's about who's doing the planting and who's going to watch after these trees as they mature. And so it remains to be seen if these urban forests in these two different communities will be resilient. We at least have some initial evidence of establishment success in East Palo Alto, but I think definitely these colleagues are on the right track. And I'm here today really to share their work, but don't want to in any way take credit for all the amazing decisions, really bold actions that they've been taking. So with that, I have to acknowledge all of my colleagues from Canopy and East Palo Alto, as well as from Philadelphia Parks and Rec, and thank them for the ability to share this with you today. I have a lot of great materials to share back with them from all of the presentations that I listened to earlier.